Welcome to the Hierarchies Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century from the periphery. This podcast is ad-free and accessible to everyone thanks to the generous donations of Patreon supporters on patreon.com/HierarchiesTimes. For as little as $5 a month or $50 a year, you can help keep this podcast independent that way. The Hierarchies Times is named after the James Baldwin book The Fire Next Time, and the music is by Ibrahim Youssef. Thank you for listening and take care. Hey everyone, so this is a conversation with Marie Berry and Milli Lake. They are the co-founders and principal investigators of the Women's Rights After War project. We primarily spoke about their article on Inconvenient Findings, which sort of tries to answer the following question. What happens when research findings challenge the work that policymakers are invested in promoting? So as you might imagine, and as happens in most episodes on the Hierarchies Times, we started with this question and this kind of led us down a number of different interesting paths, you might say. So we spoke about who gets excluded when certain interests, such as class, are maintained. We kind of broadly talked about the limitations of many quote-unquote women's empowerment programs around the world. We kind of used the examples of Rwanda, of Bosnia, and of Lebanon, and so on and so forth. And one of the questions that I sort of also asked is, should we make inconvenient findings less inconvenient, i.e. should we package them in a certain way? And I think you'll find the answers quite interesting. And as I mentioned, and as is pretty frequent on this podcast, we also kind of talked about broader topics such as the very idea of nation states as being very normative, and as well the role of futurism and speculative movements such as solar punk, Afrofuturism, and so on in discussing topics such as post-war contexts, and here I'm saying post-war in quotation as well, and kind of trying to subvert, we might say, the war logics that are embedded in most of these examples that we explore. So I will leave it at that. Thank you for listening and take care.
My name is Marie Berry. I am a feminist researcher and writer, and I am calling in today from Denver, Colorado.
Thanks, Marie. Thanks, Joey. My name's Milli Lake, also a feminist researcher and writer, calling in from London, and I teach classes at the London School of Economics.
Thanks a lot for doing this. We'll be primarily talking about a paper that you two co-wrote, and then, as with most episodes of this podcast, we'll probably take it somewhere else. But so you wrote this this paper and an associated blog post on women's rights after war, which is this project that you're involved in. So just to kind of start us off, can you talk a bit about the project and also what the paper is about?
Yeah, absolutely. So Milli and I kind of dreamed up this project years ago while we were both graduate students doing our dissertation fieldwork in different places, but we were meeting in Central Africa, in Rwanda is actually where we met. And I think the origins of the project were really in conversations that we had with each other about about what we saw going on, both where I was based in Rwanda, but also where Milli was based in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, on the efforts to empower, quote unquote, empower women in these places, especially kind of both in the judicial and legal arena, but also in especially in Rwanda in the political arena. And we noticed that there was a real celebration. This is, back in 2011, 2012, there was a real celebration of the Rwandan example as a model for other countries around the world who were interested in empowering women, because Rwanda's had the world's highest level of women in parliament since for decades now, less than 10 years after the end of its brutal genocide in 1994. Rwanda elected the world's largest kind of majority, or not majority at that point, but highest level of women to parliament, and then soon surpassed that with a majority, and today has 62% women in its national legislature. And yet what we were seeing, and I think what Milli and I saw so often, was the real limited way in which that sort of news headline actually played out in the day-to-day lives of women that we were meeting with and working with and so on. And so we started kind of trying to ask the question of who benefits from women's empowerment programs and statistics. Which women benefit? Are women actually the real beneficiaries of this of these projects to try to kind of increase the level of women in these formal political institutions? Or perhaps is it actually a project, in the Rwandan case at least, of where the regime is really the main beneficiary, because it's actually had an ability to generate international recognition. The president Paul Kagame has won numerous awards. There's been sort of a celebration amongst aid donors that there's this really strong commitment towards women's empowerment in Rwanda, and yet for ordinary women, we saw so many limitations of this. And so, I mean, Milli perhaps can tell you more, but the origins of the Women's Rights After War project were really to ask this question in other places around the globe, emerging from armed conflict, where there had been a concerted effort on the part of both the government and the international community to try to put women into these positions of political power as a way of building a more liberal, durable peace. This idea that if we get women into the government, if we get women to the peace table, perhaps if we even include women into the military and the police, we will build these more gender-sensitive societies, which is part of building a more robust, durable, kind of liberal democracy. And I think what Milli and I, our starting point was very skeptical of this. And indeed, I think we, throughout the work that we've done with the Women's Rights After War project, which now, we work, we've been doing research in Rwanda, but also in Colombia, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Iraq, and Bosnia, trying to understand the dynamics of this kind of women's empowerment rhetoric and interventions, to see really who is it at the end of the day that's benefiting from the inclusion of women in these spaces. And I think we have a lot to say about kind of what we found. Certainly we found some really remarkable stories of incredible, inspiring women who are in the government and in the political system of these places. And yet we also are deeply skeptical of the lack of attention towards systems like class when we're talking about who benefits and which women benefit from these programs. Milli, maybe you could describe too a bit about the project and sort of what the dreams were for the project.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just add to that a couple of points, and one is that a kind of, as Marie has just described really beautifully, I think the kind of motivating case where we, the country where we first met, Rwanda, was like a very stark example in many ways of how the inclusion of some women, women from particular linguistic, ethnic, class backgrounds, can serve the goals of gender equality without necessarily feminist priorities and objectives and the goals of equality and peace more, conceived of more expansively or holistically, because you have the elevation of certain women at the expense of and to the kind of detriment of women from more marginalized backgrounds. And I think while that served as a motivating case for us, it prompted like a real a much broader set of questions, both in across a number of the kind of transitional post-war contexts that form the basis of our project, but also kind of allowed us to think a bit more expansively about the way that both moments of kind of crisis or transition or kind of rupture, critical junctures, create these opportunities for certain reform efforts to kind of I guess to be capitalized on, to kind of capitalize on the gains of some of these openings that allow the pursuit of particular single axis kind of goals, but that when we don't think kind of expansively about who benefits, as Marie just described, then we miss the ways in which we kind of miss the ways in which women in this, in the focus of this particular project from different backgrounds are continue to be kind of underserved by these reform efforts. So I think one of the major goals of the project was to really think about how class-based inequalities, ethnic inequalities, race-based inequalities, and are kind of reproduced by gender inclusionary policy. And then also to think about the broader structures of colonial and imperial violence and other forms of violence that have manifested historically in a number of the countries that we have been looking at, and thinking about how some of those fissures are also kind of similarly reproduced by the inclusion of women from very particular backgrounds of existing privilege, or who are dominant in the post-war settlement. So I think while those served as the kind of guiding questions for the project, research questions for the project, we also wanted to build a kind of research team that allowed us to think more expansively about what kind of just and inclusive and emancipatory peace looks like and feels like and is experienced. And so we have been fortunate enough to work with a really phenomenal team of researchers, many of whom you can find on our website, but particularly Sindhuja and Soraya, our project managers, who have been working together with us for 3 years now to think about both the research goals of the project, but also the other ways that we can challenge existing kind of structures of oppression and domination, and think about how we can realize and practice some of the politics that undergird the project in our work, in our research, and in our collaborations. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Mary.
Absolutely. Yeah. As Milli pointed out, I think the project really had two goals. One was the set of research questions that we sort of outlined around kind of who benefits from women's empowerment reforms, and which women in particular. And then the second real goal, as Milli highlighted, was to think a bit more radically about how to convene a feminist research team in the 21st Century Academy, and to think about what outputs we actually valued, because we are so conditioned to see authoritative knowledge kind of anointed as only in, the written word. It's an article that gets published and cited, and that becomes the currency of the academic enterprise. And I think what we were seeing, especially as we were interacting with movements and with communities around the globe that we were, very privileged and fortunate to be able to connect with throughout this research, is that so much of the complexity and the nuance of people's lives gets lost in the kind of reduction to the written word. And so we've been thinking about how to kind of how to produce knowledge that is more creative, that uses different mediums, that uses arts-based methods and kind of oral stories and things like that, so as to think within our own sort of kind of small research collective what we might offer towards the greater discipline, that in some ways kind of pushes back against this anointing of kind of the kind of obscure written word behind a paywall, which is what most academic articles get published, as the thing that captures, quote unquote, objective truth, or any sort of valid theoretical insights. And so that's been a secondary sort of priority for us. And I think we just actually had a wonderful workshop with our team that really, where we could get creative and use different mediums. And we created, kind of collages that represented a lot of the findings that we were talking about, some of the themes we were talking about, just trying to figure out ways of the whole point of the workshop was really to think more boldly and creatively about how we represent the kind of core stories in the project.
Yeah, thanks for that. And one of the things that really caught my attention when I was reading first the paper and then the blog post is that you asked this question, which I really feel is basically an evergreen question, which cuts across multiple fields, which is what happens when research findings challenge the work that policymakers are invested in promoting. And as I mentioned, I think it's an evergreen question. Immediately when I was reading it, I actually thought of something that might seem completely different, which is the topic of degrowth in economic circles, for example,
Mm-hmm.
because it's mostly still a taboo to bring it up. I think there's some kind of changes, but it's very slow, and yet it's fundamentally an economics topic, but you are more likely to find it in climate science related papers.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of anecdotally, I was in this conference in France very recently, and there's this pretty prominent degrowth researcher who did his PhD on the topic in economics, I should say. And he was invited in hundreds of different places, including like different municipalities, NGOs, what have you, to talk about degrowth, and yet not a single economics department invited him.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like anecdotally, but it's definitely something that I've seen as a pretty common problem, because fundamentally it challenges very fundamental assumptions that we're supposed to have about economic growth and capitalism, neoliberalism, etc., 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 which, I mean, listeners of this podcast I think are familiar with by now. But I guess I wanted, if it's okay with you, to talk a bit about that question in your respective fields, or your areas of interest, I should say. How have you sort of engaged with it, and what are those inconvenient findings, if I could put it that way?
Absolutely. I think that really that question hits on so many of the things that Millie and I talk about and our team talks about all the time, which also is rooted in the fact that we're both in disciplines. I'm a sociologist. Millie's a political scientist. I am I'm a kind of professor at a policy school, and there's a real push within these fields to do research that's policy relevant, that somehow can be kind of adopted quickly, and there's kind of a streamlined uptake, towards changing, whether it's the policy that's made by government actors or by NGOs or whatever it is. And I think that, in some ways, this is a really refreshing and important shift from some of the more some of the academic research, of the past, that perhaps is a bit more out of touch with kind of pressing questions related to people's lives. And at the same time, we find so often that the pressure to kind of design research projects that will speak to policy questions sometimes can really narrow the radical, bold, imaginative questions that that I think academics are actually well positioned to think about and to ask. And so one of the things that comes up for us is that we're really speaking to, in a lot of our publications, the women's rights, the champions of women's rights, whether it's advocates of the women, peace, and security agenda, which is the kind of project or agenda over the last 20 plus years, started at the United Nations with UN Resolution 1325, and then a series of subsequent resolutions, which really aims to foreground women in transitions from insecurity to security. So especially to think about gender and women's inclusion in contexts that are emerging from armed conflict. And, at the same time, that's just one aspect of the broader conversation around the importance of women's empowerment and women's rights. And so what we find is that oftentimes when we are talking about the importance of women's empowerment and women's inclusion in these spaces, there's a kind of audience that says that wants to make sure that this entire kind of architecture of advocacy and of programmatic interventions that are focused on women is able to continue to grow and to become more and more, robust. And I think what Millie and my findings oftentimes suggests is that the kind of the narrow focus on women's inclusion and women's empowerment neglects questions of class and race and caste and many other categories and axes of difference. And so
just to kind of tap in on that point, I mean, I think there's a real desire, especially among people embedded in kind of policy practitioner spaces to celebrate the gains that have been made. And there have been like really tremendous gains that have been made in the arena of gender equality and women's rights, particularly in post-war spaces. And so I think there is a kind of celebration of those gains that can sometimes perceive, I guess, critiques of the broader structural constraints and challenges that persist as an attack on the gains that have been made. And I think one of the things that we face again and again in this research, and really without wishing to undermine the work of the amazing kind of gender activists and advocates of women's rights that have worked so hard to kind of ensure access and inclusion and equality in various different political, economic spaces. But at the same time, kind of call attention to the ways that this what we kind of term in some of our writing, this single axis focus on gender and women's inclusion can reinforce and entrench other hierarchies of oppression if we are not also sensitive to the ways in which ethnic, class-based, caste, racial inequalities, and also in post-war spaces, importantly, conflict fissures, so political conflict, are kind of obscured or invisibilized in efforts to incorporate women into existing structures of power. So I think that's one thing that we kind of butt up against all the time, and to try and kind of strike that balance between both celebrating the gains, particularly of activists who have, who are fighting on the ground for rights and inclusion and access, and then also the kind of policy architectures that have supported those efforts. But then on the other side, we also have, we exist within these massive research institutions and are kind of beholden to grant funding and research incentive structures, promotion and tenure criteria that serve to kind of de-radicalize at every stage of the process, right? So in addition to this kind of I think like inconvenience of some of the findings that our research reveals, we also have this inconvenience of that I think many scholars and researchers within the academy face and are criticized and kind of held accountable for, quite rightly, by activists, which is that there, all the incentive structures within our disciplines and our fields and our institutions are set up to kind of dampen and to quash challenges to existing status quo hierarchies of power. And I think one of the things that Marie and I have both struggled with, but also really appreciated the opportunity to really kind of take on and think more deeply and more critically about is how we can straddle that, how we can kind of work within these institutions without de-radicalizing and softening and dampening the work that we consider to be important. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Marie.
No, I think that's exactly right, Milli. Just to make it really concrete what we're talking about, I think when we say, single access advocacy and the limits of that, is that we see so often the for instance, the celebration of women's inclusion into politics without recognizing that some of the women in politics are representing these kind of capital interests related to capital, interests related to particular racial cleavages or dominance, colonial legacies that have anointed particular groups. And then this is a way of kind of preserving and maintaining the dominance of those groups. Or for instance, the way in which many women in politics also kind of embody these hyper patriarchal legacies as well. Often because of their connections and ties through powerful men, their husbands, their fathers, etc. And I think, what we have been calling for and what we've been really trying to highlight is that the inclusion of women into systems that are creating oppression is not going to lessen the oppression those systems are creating. I think police and military are the perfect example. The inclusion of women into police is not going to soften the inherent violence of police as a system, as a source of violence and insecurity in many people's lives. One of the other points that I would just make to follow along this conversation around inconvenient findings is that we talk a lot in the project, the Women's Rights After War project, about the difference between spectacular and non-spectacular violence, and the way in which so much of the advocacy around kind of women's rights and women's advocacy, and also just around kind of peace agreements and building more kind of robust liberal democracies in general, focuses on this attention towards spectacular violence. And by that we're talking about war violence that looks like bullets and guns and people in the streets, rather than the insidious violence of patriarchy, of the brutalities of inequality as a result of capitalism, of the slow erosion of our climate, and the kind of seeping toxicity in people's waters and soils that creates harm to people's bodies. And what we see so often is that policy relevant research is focused on those spectacular manifestations of violence, addressing particular types of violence and the fallout of particular types of violence, rather than on the much more kind of holistic systems that create so much harm in people's bodies and families and communities. And our goal, or I think one of our kind of points that we've been trying to make in regards to this, the kind of pushing back against some of this pressure to really make all of your results relevant to particular policy actors, is to say that we need to actually think more holistically about that sometimes our findings are not actually neat, and they do not direct themselves to a particular NGO or a particular member of Congress to change, a set of policy. It's actually about unraveling the entire, so many of these, systems that are creating such harm in the first place. And so when you start to talk about tackling legacies of imperialism, when you start to talk about tackling and unraveling, the dominance of capitalism, we get much more messy. And then messiness is sometimes less conducive to policy, kind of the neatness that's required for policy relevance. And so I think that's really where this conversation tends to go when we talk about it.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts. One, when you talk about which women get in power in many contexts. I mean, in Lebanon, with the exception of a single woman that I can think of, the only women who have gotten into parliament have been either the wives or the widows, or I think there's a sister of powerful men, essentially, because they're inheriting. It's like inheriting a family clan, or inheriting family legacy, or a business, or in the case of Lebanon, lots of warlords and oligarchs as well. But of course, this is also a good segue to, I first read your essay through Ida Hosic, who was a previous guest. That's episode 69 for those listening. She had written this piece on the Dayton Agreement in Bosnia, WPS, which is the Women, Peace and Security Agenda at the UN, and this concept of entrenched manliness, as she calls it, in specifically in ethnic power sharing agreements. And obviously, given that I'm from Lebanon, she's from Bosnia, we had an entire conversation about the differences and similarities between those two contexts. But I was wondering if you can sort of, referencing also what's been happening lately, and I should say for the record that we're recording this on January 14th. This episode will be out, I think, next month, so around mid-February or so. How do you sort of approach this topic, or would you say that those as she calls this entrenched manliness of those power sharing agreements, kind of confirm what you call narrowly defined arenas for justice, if that makes sense?
Absolutely. I think Ida Hosic's work is incredibly valuable in this area. her conversation on the podcast, and also the blog post that the podcast was building from, really highlighted the limits of these sort of highly institutionalized efforts to bring about profound social change, like the Dayton Accords. And in that conversation, she talks about the fact that Dayton really there were three Daytons, right? There was the Dayton from the international community that was a source of major celebration when it came to thinking about what the role is of the West and of the human rights regime and of NATO in terms of building kind of a more liberal, 21st, 20th and 21st century, how that, the way in which it kind of celebrated the United States' role in terms of mediating the end of conflict and war. And in that sense, that Dayton was, there was a huge farce there, which was that Dayton didn't really stop the war. It stopped the bullets from flying, right? It got the actual military part of the war to be ceased, but the war continues to play out through really insidious politics and through this exceptionally violent and structurally violent inequality and ethnic kind of separation that we see increasing. And just this week, as we're recording, this became so stark as we saw this formally sort of banned celebration of Bosnian Serbs on a day celebrating basically an ethno-nationalist project of Serb separation, which has deeply, disturbing implications for the durability of a unified Bosnia and and for peace. The second Dayton was the Dayton of the political elites in Bosnia, which was really the people that came to the table, right? It was the champions of war that were rewarded with the kind of ability to divvy up the country in ways that served their political constituencies and their political agendas. And this has resulted in one of the most deeply kind of corrupt the ties between the political elites and capital and illicit economies is very, very robust in Bosnia. And so there's this second Dayton that basically created an unworkable political system where reform from below was really impossible. And then the third Dayton, she talks about is the Dayton as experienced by ordinary Bosnians. And this is where I think there's this real synergy with what Milli and I were just talking about. I mean, we find so often that the more technocratic or institutionalized solutions to armed conflict that become the center point of the conversation about transitions from war to peace, like peace accords, oftentimes fail to dismantle the underlying systems that are responsible for creating the grievances that led to the war in the first place. Mm-hmm. So what Dayton did is it codified those underlying deeply rooted economic, political, social grievances that actually were not resolved. They were not even softened as a result of the Dayton Accords. In fact, they were hardened and deepened. And so when we think about that system as a peace agreement, I mean, this is an indictment on the concept of peace, right? This was not about peace. This was about preserving particular interests and status quo and wreaking havoc on the kind of, structural, the well-being of most Bosnians, but also on just the kind of the idea of, you got to kind of think back on Galtung's conversation about a negative versus a positive peace, right? This created and cemented the most negative peace possible. One in which people, not only faced continued dispossession, continued separation from their, neighbors and their country people, but one that has led to more and more disillusionment, I think, with the project of a unified Bosnia, which is it's a deeply depressing, disturbing, and infuriating thing, I think, for many observers today, and certainly for many Bosnians. So what what this kind of entrenched manliness really, and this conversation I think really highlights, is the way in which these interventions can so often neglect those underlying, kind of systems of patriarchy, of class, of imperial legacies, these systems which are really responsible for the conflict in the first place, and instead they can in fact entrench them.
Yeah, and we see this in all of our cases. I mean, this is a theme that I think we had kind of observed almost anecdotally way back before we conceived of this project in our early dissertation research, and suspected that it would play out similarly in a variety of different political contexts, different post-war settlements, etc. And it's been really kind of both astounding and disappointing and kind of unsurprising in some ways to just see how profoundly those patterns that Marie just described in Bosnia echo in really every single one of our cases. And just to kind of think about Nepal and Colombia, which are the two cases we've been focusing on most recently as cases of power sharing in the aftermath of war rather than the dominance of one particular party. So we and you see armed groups in many of the contexts that we studied converted into political parties in the aftermath of the post-war settlement, and then those kinds of war logics and animosities and grievances being reproduced through the inclusion and entry of women into politics, and to kind of go back to what we were talking about right at the beginning, which women are then kind of selected to pioneer and to advocate for the goals of particular group turned political parties or agendas of particular factions from the war. And so you see these kind of conflict era grievances playing out in multiple different arenas and forms and spaces, political and economic spaces, into this, well into this period of peace, and kind of sanitized through the guise or the ideology of gendered emancipation or gendered equality and inclusion. And I think one of the patterns or the kind of ideas that we keep coming back to are the ways in which women can be ardent kind of advocates of both patriarchal and ethno-nationalist politics. And we see women taking on these roles in Colombia, in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, in Rwanda, in all of the countries that we study. And indeed here and in the US, of course.
You want to say, Mary?
Well, no, I was just going to try to ground what Milli said in some concrete examples. I think when we say we see women representing particular interests, like we were in a department in Colombia right before the pandemic. Actually, we were there in February 2020, right as everything was starting, and we were meeting with women's activists and with people in politics and with journalists and other people. And, in this one particular area, there 3 women had just been elected to the kind of local assembly. And of those 3 women, one of them was this remarkable activist, right? She was rooted in communities, had a long history of doing important work for her community, of advocating for kind of issues related to women's well-being, health, indigenous rights, and this woman was sort of representing that history while she was in the local assembly. The other 2 women were tied to powerful political families that were invested in businesses. I'm not remembering particularly exactly which industries, but they were industries related to mining and extraction, things like that were responsible for some of the conflict, and especially with the dynamics between the kind of the guerrillas, the FARC, and the paramilitaries, which were oftentimes defending some of these mining ventures, these other ventures, right? And so these women had actually entered into politics and were not representing the interests of women, but they were absolutely representing the interests of these family businesses that were bound up with the conflict. And so I think it was just one of those examples that was clear about what we're talking about, right? Like it's not so disconnected from it's not so abstract. I think, from in the United States, we can think of people like Sarah Palin. We can think of people like Lauren Boebert from Colorado. And these are women who are representing extremely difficult, kind of proto-fascist political agendas, and certainly not advancing, kind of broader feminist commitments.
One thing that Ida and I really had in common, I mentioned there were these similarities and these differences. One of the very glaring similarities of the Ta'if agreement, which is the one in Lebanon, which obviously happened before the Dayton agreement, it happened in 89, 1990, was that effectively, and I was kind of quoting myself, an essay I wrote some years ago, of like the agents of war became the de facto agents of peace.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because they know this, and they regularly remind us of this. Like prominent politicians today, either ex or current warlords in Lebanon, always either mention those threats. So a concrete example would be in October 2019, there was the big uprising in Lebanon, the biggest one so far. Right. And a lot of the major politicians who are in government were always saying that they were kind of worried, or like, be careful, or else it could be civil war. But of course, they are the only ones who can enact a civil war. They are the ones with the guns. They are the ones with the organized militias. The protesters were not, but they were effectively treating us, and I was among the protesters, as they were effectively threatening us without necessarily saying so directly. And other times it wasn't as subtle anyway. There was direct threats as well, and including one assassination last year. That's a different conversation. But this concept of, as I'm kind of calling them myself, like the de facto agents of peace, essentially that you don't have a choice as a civil society person, as just an activist, as even an ordinary civilian who's not particularly political, whether you want to or not. This is the new reality now, and this new reality was established. If you talk about the new generation, was established before you were born, or maybe you were very young, or what have you. In the case of Lebanon, the Ta'if agreement is basically an international agreement. Like all of the major powers, either directly or indirectly, kind of said, okay, this is how the situation is going to be. And as with all of those cases in quote unquote post-war conflicts, women were often the ones, or were always the ones, who were kind of left out. And the quintessential example in Lebanon, as indeed in Argentina or even in Bosnia and in many of the other cases, were these mothers and wives and sisters of those that were called the disappeared. And of course, in Argentina, they're often called las madres, like the mothers.
Sure. Yeah.
In Lebanon, is the same thing as well, because the vast majority of those who were forcibly disappeared were men, like of quote unquote fighting age, as they would say. And so a lot of those who were campaigning for the truth quote unquote in the post-war era were their relatives, their female relatives usually. And so this became effectively highly gendered, as war always is, of course. And they were kind of, to cut a long story short, because I bring it up in previous episodes, and I will one day hopefully do a specific episode on the disappeared in Lebanon. And when I'm saying the disappeared, I'm putting it in quotations, like those who were forcibly disappeared and kidnapped, were effectively told to just forget about them and to declare them legally dead. The government did their own estimates of how many people were actually forcibly disappeared, and it's a much lower number than what those women are saying. In fact, like, there are more women who say that they have male relatives disappeared than there are officially disappeared men, according to the Lebanese government. And so it's just all of those things, and yet it is one part of my research is to kind of put into question this concept of a post-war, and we're using Lebanon as my example, because it is considered as a success story, or at least it was back then. If you look at a lot of the headlines that I go through, a lot of the pieces that were written, because effectively the men with guns, as Ida also calls them, agreed to stop shooting one another. Like, it was really that simple. The territories that they had won, the effective reshuffling of power compared to the pre-war era, all of those things were consolidated. They effectively, and it was, of course, all portrayed and packaged in this very neoliberal framework, as in, we're going to rebuild Beirut, we're going to get all of those outside investments, which effectively today is an entire part of the city is completely privatized, and it's kind of a ghost town at this point, even before the explosion of 2020, I should say. So kind of rambling a bit, but all of this to say that um, when one thing that I used to do is I would focus on the story of those who I'm calling the disappeared, and through those stories, through their lived experiences, and I've interviewed a number of them and so on, interviewed their relatives. I then put into question, what do we mean by post-war? What do we mean by post? Who is moving on? Who is benefiting from this quote unquote peace? Yeah.
I think that just hits home with everything that we've been talking and thinking about. I mean, when I mentioned the focus that we've had on the kind of on troubling that distinction between spectacular and non-spectacular violence, the same holds for troubling the distinction between the pre-war, the war, and the post-war period, because ultimately the same structures and systems that are causing the physical sort of extreme violence during the period of quote unquote war are actually not truncated when they're not dismantled, right, by a peace agreement. And instead the same sort of, whether it's, ethno-racial fissures or whether it's massive sort of inequality, which is, so often at the core of conflict.
Or the everyday violence perpetrated by security agents on
absolutely
police.
Or by patriarchy and the insidiousness of insecurity that women feel, not only, kind of because of an opposing army, but because of partners, members of their community, family, extended family, police, right? These forms of patriarchal violence stretch far, before and far after kind of acute periods of war.
And I think one of the things that we really want to kind of emphasize when we're troubling this distinction between spectacular and non-spectacular forms and manifestations of violence, when we talk to women activists in the various, different localities in the countries that we've been doing research in, almost always, when we ask women about the most kind of profound or, what are the biggest challenges they face in their lives, what are the most pressing forms of violence they face in their lives, these are kind of everyday manifestations of these much larger kind of structural systems of oppression. And I think one of the things that we have been thinking much more about recently in the project is the ways that it's not just the war cleavages and kind of fissures that are carried on into the post-war and the insidious kind of everyday forms of violence that are carried on, but also really kind of historicizing that violence and thinking about the ways that colonial legacies and legacies of kind of capitalism and globalization have served to shore up those forms of violence and kind of render the conditions for those forms of violence both kind of possible and inevitable almost. And so by kind of tackling these, by putting the Band-Aid on some of these, spectacular or more visible forms of violence, the peace agreements, the bringing women into kind of inclusive security sectors, etc., none of those underlying structures and systems of oppression are addressed, and they continue to wreak kind of pain and suffering on women, predominantly from groups, ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, class backgrounds, who are the kind of who are the most disenfranchised and kind of underserved by those systems.
Well, and it goes far beyond women too, right? It's
right, exactly.
women, but it's also, I think it's really the majority of people that are living in these robustly unequal societies, right?
Absolutely. But I think when we think about furthering the goals of gender equality, it becomes really important, I think, to recognize that the majority of women are also not served by these kind of single access inclusion.
Totally.
And not to bring it back to the conversation about women's rights, because I think actually that is, although it's like a big, the main piece of our project, it's certainly not, one of the things we're trying to do is challenge a little bit the way that discourse is kind of centered to the exclusion of other powerful kind of persisting inequalities.
If I could just add to Joey, what you were mentioning about the disappeared, right?
Yeah.
This is one of those, I think, deeply um, uh, unaddressed in our current frameworks. One of these kind of um, it's it, in all of the places that we have done work and that we've done work kind of individually as well, this question of whether or not there's any real possibility for quote unquote peace when you have such an unaddressed and unacknowledged kind of like lack of knowledge, lack of answers, lack of an essential truth about where our loved ones are, where are our loved ones' bodies, right there. I've met with women in Bosnia who had every opportunity to testify at the at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. They've had every opportunity to even receive some forms of kind of small reparations and things like that, but those don't matter at all because they are still missing their son's bones, right? And there's no peace, there's no end to the searching, there's no end, there's no sense of peace that's possible until there's a knowledge about where their child, right, is. And I think I've been struck repeatedly by these stories in other places. I mean, I think in Sri Lanka, a similar kind of situation happened just last year, where there was this kind of declaration that all the people that were missing are actually dead.
Yeah.
And that we can close the book on that. But there is no closed book on the loss of your loved ones, right? There can't be a closing of that book. And so without thinking about what justice looks like in a much more holistic kind of reparative framework, I think these questions of these deep pains that affect, I think, so many different places around disappearance, really thwart the building of a truly kind of like post-war period, because there is this persistent sort of violence that's done largely often by the state, right, in depriving information towards people who are missing these loved ones.
One thing that's very common because I also look at quote unquote post-war cinema in Lebanon, and one very common theme that we see sort of repeated time and time and time again is this concept of hauntings from the past. And a lot of the times, and I'm spacing out on the specific movie, I'll remember it and put it in the description. There's one film where that haunting is literally a father who was forcibly disappeared. He is the haunting in that story. And other times it's just more structural haunting, as one might call it, because Beirut, it didn't only happen in Beirut, but obviously a lot of the battles did. But Beirut's post-war reconstruction, I'm putting this in quotations, was literally done over mass graves. So we literally know of certain sites in Beirut, and it's not that big of a city. It's not that difficult to find them.
Right.
That were built over. And so you have, I think in one place you have a hotel, other places some residential buildings, what have you. And those places under them are the bones of people who, as far as the government is concerned, are officially dead. And indeed, they are, of course, dead. The bones are there, but we don't know who they are. And we don't know if there could be people, for example, who are still forcibly disappeared in Syria from the Syrian occupation of Lebanon's time. All of those examples, or in Israel for that matter, all of those examples are why I'm re-questioning this concept of post-war. I'm specifically the post of that post-war, because I'm actually trying to and I'm kind of thinking out loud, but it's part of my own PhD, my own research as well. Like this concept of a post-war, what is it erasing? How much of the war that we would identify between in Lebanon, for example, in the 70s and 80s, how much of it is still going on? Like one easy example in Lebanon is that we still had wars in the post-war, like we had 2006 between Israel and Hezbollah, everything that happened before and since as well, assassinations, regular assassinations, not a single one of which would get any kind of accountability. And so this very idea, instead of a post-war, it just becomes a not war, as I'm calling it. Like it's defined by the absence of immediate violence, essentially.
Yeah.
If I could, I totally agree, Joey. I remember a conversation with Milli years ago where she came to the United States for the very first time from London for her PhD. And the conversation was about how she was like, Milli, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but you were surprised that people don't consider the United States a post-war country,
Yeah.
right? That in political science we kind of have this like, oh no, we look over there, like that country's post-war, that country's post-war, but oh, don't mind the fact that this United States was built on a system of enslaved labor and a genocide of indigenous communities. Like how do we not consider the United States sort of this absolute sort of like it's because we are post, we are not post, right? And that's the point, is that our current sort of like social reckoning around massive racial injustice and around the dispossession of indigenous communities, I mean, these are current political conversations that are rooted in histories over the last several hundred years, that have not been reckoned with, that have not been repaired, that have not been centered in our political discourse. And said there's this idea that it's past, but it's absolutely not past, right? It's absolutely present in so many, in the way in which our kind of our inequality operates and plays out in this country. And so I don't know. I
was going to just say, it kind of calls to mind the complete shockingness, really, of the ways in which so many of our findings in political science, predominantly, but conflict studies, I guess, more broadly, are rooted on this idea of like the signing of the peace agreement, and then the fight, whether or not fighting has re-emerged within 5 years subsequently, that just completely dehistoricizes and kind of decontextualizes the ways in which violence manifests and the kind of underlying relationships and dynamics of power that ferment these repeated kind of insurgency, but also other forms of structural and racialized capitalist violence. And yeah, I mean, that's a really kind of perfect example, I think, Marie, the one that you just used. But we see this over and over again, and we see it invisibilized and kind of overlooked over and over again in the ways that the scholarship, the kind of dominant scholarship in these fields, even conceives of war and defines war in the first place. It's really...
I'll just add that I spent the last few days in northern New Mexico, which has a really interesting and very different sort of history, just in terms of kind of the Spanish dominance, and than say Colorado, where I'm sort of based, most of the time. I went to an exhibit yesterday at Fort Garland, which was a military outpost that was created in very, very southern Colorado, to basically ensure, that white settlers were able to come to this free territory and to keep the Ute Indians, as they were put at the time, in check. And this exhibit was this absolutely sort of brilliant exhibit at the Historical Museum in Fort Garland that pictured the kind of historical record of the names of these Native American children and women in particular that were actually enslaved by white settlers in Colorado and New Mexico territories, including that were kind of enslaved by people like Kit Carson, who in Colorado and in New Mexico is a name, that's everywhere. Carson National Forest, you see roads named after Kit Carson. And Kit Carson, apparently, I learned yesterday, I mean, this was news to me, had an indigenous child that he more or less bought to, raise in his household. But the assumption was that this person was raised doing additional domestic tasks, and was, I don't know all of the details, but was not treated, as one of the other children, but was instead actually stolen, and purchased from his home. And this is a history of the enslavement of Native American people is not something that I ever learned about in my history textbooks growing up. And it reminds you that the kind of this entire country is built on this structure, these original sins, right, of settler colonialism, right, and I think it just even learning a slight bit about our own, like my own kind of regional history here in Colorado is a nice way of checking this idea that like there's a clear period of atrocities that happens and then is over. Instead, it's built into the very fabric of the institutions that continues to govern, whether it's like the naming of places or the even just the way in which we have, certain infrastructure and resources in certain parts of the country and not in others. I mean, so much of this was shaped by that period of settled colonial oppression and enslavement, which is not something that I really knew much about until truly like this exhibit. So sorry, that was a bit of a tangent.
No, it's fine. It actually reminds me of so I was on this podcast called It Could Happen Here, and I was on their podcast I don't know, a couple of months ago. So, and one thing that I mentioned on that podcast is that the main difference for me would be that as someone who's from Lebanon, it has already happened, because the reference is like it could happen here as in like a really bad thing, like an apocalyptic thing, essentially, at least civil war, could happen in America. That's kind of the underlying thesis, if you're on the podcast. And it sort of made me think, and I think they had a different guest on at some point, but separately it made me think of this. I think it was a forum or something I was taking part in. I don't remember the details, but people were asking, like, which year do you think could be the year at which we reach a tipping point? They were talking about climate change specifically. And I just remember someone mentioning, I believe that person was an indigenous person, mentioning 1492. Like that is the year of the tipping point for him or for his family, for his people and so on.
Right.
And that I could remember myself thinking, like, having a light bulb over my, like an moment, like, really, right, this makes sense, because we were talking in this context about something really bad is going to happen, and this something is usually singular, so it's kind of to simplify how we were thinking. It was kind of a mental experiment, we might say. But at the end of the day, those collapses, or what we call apocalypse, usually isn't a one-day thing, isn't an overnight thing. It's actually very slow. It's more akin to a crumbling rather than a collapse. And actually, it could happen here as a very good. The first 5 episodes, I believe, of their new season is on the crumbles, as they call them. So I'm just mentioning that because I quite like it. But yeah, it's something that's been on my mind a lot. It's actually part of why I wanted to talk to you two, because I guess one of the underlying things I'm trying to get at or trying to explore is, how does one make inconvenient findings less inconvenient, right? Like, how is it just a matter of communication? Is it a matter of pressure from the street? Is it both? Like, how do you sort of deal with that question?
It's a great question. Yeah. Go ahead, Marie.
Well, I was just going to say you don't.
Yeah, make them that's what I was going to say too.
There's a reason why they're inconvenient, because they challenge existing systems and structures. They rub up against the status quo, and the status quo is not tenable. That's what we know, especially, you're talking about kind of the crumbling of apocalypse, right? That we are amidst, mass extinctions, the rising temperatures that are creating cataclysmic weather events around the world, the erosion of soil and the erosion of plant life and animal life from so many parts of the world. Like, we are already there, right? And so being convenient is being palatable and operating within existing systems. And the existing systems are what requires change. And I think Milli and I talk a lot about this, right? This idea that when we start, lamenting the way in which, the politics, like the way in which most, just think about the state system, right? Just at a very kind of, concrete thing. The idea of states, right? We are in a world in which we take states as inevitable, but they're not inevitable, right? They're relatively recent creations, and work by Harsha Walia and others talks about the formation of these borders as institutions of violence, right? That is actually what we need to do, is to move away from borders, to move away from states, to thinking more locally and more at the community level, right? Because the borders that are required to actually police state boundaries are but they are one more facet of profound violence that operates continually, in terms of of protecting certain countries from population flows that are largely flowing as a result of the policies of those countries that are solidifying and formalizing and hardening or militarizing their borders, right? And so, thinking about states as this, as one example of where, when we begin to say, like, we need to change everything, we really need to change everything.
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes really scary. And I think people then become, okay, well, you're talking about burning it all down, right? And what Milli and I always come back to, and Milli, please jump in here, is this idea that actually that's not the framework, right? What acknowledging that we're living in an apocalyptic scenario does not mean that we need to burn everything to the ground. Acknowledging that all of these women's rights reforms and these kind of liberal democratic initiatives more generally are inadequate and are failing to erode these underlying systems does not mean we need to light a fire to democracy, right? That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that there's actually a need for greater imagination of how we might structure our relationships, both with each other, with the natural world, different forms of leadership in ways that are less oppressive and less hierarchical. And that there are myriad examples of ways in which people have been doing this, right? It isn't that, I think when we say, we can continue, we must continue to be inconvenient because convenience reifies these systems. What we mean is that we should be inconvenient in pointing out and in trying to bring from periphery to center those experiments and different ways of living and leading and loving, if you will, that oftentimes are not seen as they're not dominant, right? They're rooted in communities of the subaltern. They're rooted in the periphery, and yeah.
No, I mean, I was just going to say maybe this is like a kind of slightly separate point, but I also just wanted to make the point that I think we're in a really interesting moment right now, and the fact that, so Marie and I's work has predominantly been about war, as you know, and as we've kind of talked about, but I think many of the structures of violence that we are calling attention to in our work are obviously not just present in conflict-affected, war-affected settings. All of the countries in which we live are affected by violence and the same kinds of inequalities, in albeit in slightly different ways and different manifestations. And so, as well as kind of troubling the war, not war, war post-war distinction, we're also kind of troubling that a little bit spatially and geographically as well. And I think what the kind of current, both the kind of COVID pandemic moment and then also the climate crisis is kind of revealing is that we see similar opportunity structures potentially opening that you see in periods of kind of major transition or the signing of peace agreements, etc. I mean, not to the same extent potentially, but we see this language of crisis being leveraged, this language of kind of rupture being leveraged. And I think the pandemic in particular, certainly in liberal democracies and kind of industrialized economies, has really created a little bit of a reckoning and a recognition actually that the systems, the current systems that we take for granted are not serving most people. And this isn't necessarily because the systems are broken, but it's because they're working kind of exactly as they were designed and intended to. And so the kind of abandonment of poor working class kind of communities and the suffering that is kind of borne by people living at the peripheries is becoming, I think, maybe visible in different ways to more and more people. And so I think while I completely kind of echo and reaffirm everything Marie just said about the ways that our findings and our arguments shouldn't be convenient, I also think we are existing potentially in a moment where there is more susceptibility or willingness or kind of openness to being able to hear some of these arguments in different ways, and particularly these arguments about the ways in which kind of capitalism, imperialism, racism and other forms of inequality, patriarchy sustain and reinforce one another, and the victims of patriarchal oppression are also the victims of these other forms of kind of structural inequalities, the primary victims. And so I think that there is not necessarily a way to make these arguments convenient, and certainly not, actually there's a real danger to making them sanitized and de-radicalized in ways that make them easier to hear for people invested in reinforcing and kind of perpetuating status quo power dynamics. But there is also an opportunity potentially right now to call attention, I think, to some of these findings, these inconvenient findings, in ways that people are maybe, hopefully, I would hope, willing to hear, that they may not previously have been so open to.
That was much more coherent than my ramble, which was I was trying to get towards somewhere, but I was kind of rambling. But yeah, that's good.
Well, I mean, both of you sort of link to, in one way or another, like the importance of also imagination and how thinking of alternatives in one way or another. And one thing that I've been doing more in this podcast, is talking about these different futurisms, these different speculative movements and speculative, whether it's in fiction or in politics or in both, like solar punk, Afrofuturism, indigenous futurism, and all of those things. Sort of like as a way of wrapping up this conversation, before we get into the book section, how do you think about these futurisms, and how do they kind of inform your own thinking and your own work?
I mean, we love this question. We could talk about this forever. We would have happily spent the whole podcast talking about this. But I think one of the things that we just kind of constantly come back to, and we can talk about this when we talk about the books that we are influenced by as well, is the ways that kind of communities living at the margins have always kind of out of necessity carved out spaces of intimacy, of creativity, of radical love. And I think, Marie, we always come back to this Ruth Wilson Gilmore quote that I think she might have even alluded to earlier, that there are many of us already living those kind of alternatives, and that we need to move towards thinking not so much about like policy recommendations and kind of actionable reforms that we can that lay out a blueprint for social transformation, and instead really think about, kind of step back and think about both where change comes from. And we know that change comes from the streets, change comes from the peripheries, change never comes from those who are invested in reinforcing the status quo. So it wouldn't be for us to, kind of from where we're sitting, to lay out what a pathway to change or transformation looks like. That actually instead we should think more creatively about the values that we wish to center in a more peaceful and free world, and that we don't want to offer a blueprint for what that looks like, but we can kind of come back to reaffirming what values we center in this praxis. So we always talk about kind of care, embodied love, community, non-hierarchy, solidarity, interdependence, and think about the ways in which we can kind of center these politics, not only in our vision of a more just and free world, but also in our everyday lives. And I think one of the things that we often forget, or people seem to often forget in this work, that is, if you can't kind of live your politics in your everyday life, if your politics aren't personal, if you can't be kind of practicing the politics of love and solidarity that you wish to see in the world, then there isn't any hope. And so all we can do is kind of work to foster and create those communities of care within the spaces that we occupy. And I think that's one of the things that we've been really deeply committed to thinking about, kind of more broadly and more structurally, but also within the context of our project and how we realize our project and how we interact and relate with one another and with the people that we care about, and in the workspaces that we inhabit. And just kind of constantly coming back to that and thinking about the ways in which both, as you said, creativity, imagination, community, and radical love ground us in every aspect of our work.
May, what about you?
I mean, what she said, right? I think that's just great. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah, I
mean,
mean, we do quote this line from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, a brilliant abolitionist thinker and writer, a lot, which is that, you know, calls to revolution are often creatively stunted, and we must instead consider that what the world will become, as she puts it, already exists in fragments and pieces and experiments and possibilities. And so much of our own kind of dreaming is about looking at those who are living kind of boldly and in these experiments and thinking radically at all levels, and thinking about whether our work can find ways of centering those stories and perhaps elevating, amplifying those experiments. But to me, I feel probably the greatest amount of comfort that I do, given the kind of state of the world, when I realize that it's not just a small radical fringe group of people who are talking about building more free worlds, right? So many of us around the world are living, you know, in relationships that challenge kind of a heteronormative status quo. We are mothering in ways that differ from the kind of you know, again, the heteronormative family. We are loving in ways, we are leading in ways, we are organizing in relationship with people and all sentient life and non-sentient life in ways that reject kind of the capitalist relationship to nature that says that you only have value if you can be extracted and turned into something for human profit and good, right? There are so many people who are thinking of ways of building more beauty into the world, and those are the converse, or those are the experiments, the possibilities, right? That I think are a lot of fuel for my imagination, and certainly for our collective imagination in this project. I love listening to some of the episodes that you've done on solar punk, and the again kind of, I mean, we talk a lot about abolition and the relationship between abolitionist movements and anarcho punk movements. We read a lot about, you know, about the what do we read a lot of? I mean, just, you know, movements like Afrofuturism. I mean, there's so much to be gained when we think about the amount of work that it takes to radically imagine a world that doesn't rely on the systems that currently exist, right? And I think the more we can do that, the more hopeful I am about the direction, like both research is going, but also just the way in which we live our world.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add that one thing that I found, and this might sound odd at first, but one thing that I found very, very refreshing is I've been listening to a number of podcasts on, you know, the classics or ancient history or whatever, usually Greek or Roman, but sometimes some Ottoman, some Byzantine, some whatever. And it's very interesting that even in those spaces, which is a relatively new phenomenon, at least it wasn't as vocal as it's been in the past, let's give or take decade or so, there's been this reimagining or retelling of different stories that were taken for granted in the past. Like usually, like, let's say, feminist retelling of the Odyssey, or, you know, just kind of thinking off the top of my head. And because one thing that they tend to do, and it's not just the myths, I should say, it's also like just actual historical accounts and debunking certain things and re-questioning the sort of the narratives that were taken for granted based on who the sources was and all of that. But the one thing that's very interesting from all of that, other than just geeking out on history, is more this question of what if, right? And this question of just those two words, and how much, like, I've seen historians spend several hours debating what if, right? Like, what if, you know, and sometimes it's big events or big, you know, like, what if Caesar hadn't crossed the Rubicon or stuff like that. But other stuff is more like, well, what if there was just bad weather on that day? What if, like, they just couldn't cross the Alps because the weather was just too bad, and that's it? And what if, and all of those things. And it's how you start stopping taking for granted those things that we've taken for granted. Like, well, this is 1492, let's just pick a well-known date, the Reconquista, quote unquote, which is a polemic term in its own, and Christopher Columbus goes there, and then it's kind of a timeline as if this is the only way things could have been, essentially. And this whole what if kind of leads us into interesting ways. And sort of in the spirit of that, obviously one good way of doing that for me is books and reading different kinds of books. So what are like 3 books that you would recommend to our listeners, and why? And I'm actually very proud of the segue. I'm usually bad at segues.
No, that was a beautiful segue. It was completely pro. I'm gonna start because thanks to my very good friend Rachel Nihus, who many years ago forced me to read this book, Revolutionary Mothering by Alexis Pauline Gumbs, which really kind of changed my life in a lot of ways, in that it tapped into, I think, and articulated in a lot of ways themes that I had been thinking quite deeply about already. It's called Revolutionary Mothering, Love on the Front Lines. And it's really a book about everything Marie was just describing, about the ways that we can kind of think differently about a politics of love in the radical transformation of society, how we think about the family unit first and foremost, but also ways of caring and mothering and loving and nurturing and kind of building feminist futures in creative and kind of non-conventional ways that challenge ideas of hierarchy and patriarchy and dominance and oppression in our most, in the most intimate spaces of our personal lives first and foremost. And then the kind of second book is this recent book from Alexis Gumbs that has grounded, I think, this phase of our project in really, I mean, it's talk about beautiful segues. It's really like an incredible pairing, I think, these 2 books together. This Alexis Gumbs' new book, Undrowned Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals, really taps into the ways that it opens with just this beautiful preface that we read out in many times actually in our retreat before Christmas, about breathing and the ways in which our breathing as human beings is kind of interconnected, and we breathe the same breath, we breathe the same air as one another, as the sea mammals kind of, and other forms of life beyond humanity all around the world. And I think it kind of, it beautifully, it just really beautifully brings together this idea that I think we've been thinking about much more in this phase of the project, about climate justice and the extractive relationship between capitalism, profit, and kind of business, politics, and war. And the book isn't about that necessarily, but I think what the book does is really tap into the idea that extraction from the environment is not a viable pathway to peace, and that we, in order to thrive, we need to really think about the ways in which every part of our planet is thriving and strengthened by one another. And so kind of the book is a meditation primarily, looking to sea mammals and sea life as a space to learn.
And I am a big fan of sea life. I grew up on an island and feel the most at home when I'm in the ocean. And so I also just really echo Milli's encouragement to read Alexis Pauline Gumbs. Really, everything she writes is magnificent. Did you have a third, Milli?
No, I just decided. Well, I was going to talk about, there were a few other books I was maybe going to talk about, but yeah, I think I'll just leave it with those 2.
That's great. I mean, actually, Joey, as you were introducing the conversation about books and asking these questions of what if, I mean, I just read the Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Weingrau, and it is a book really that does that, right? It asks what if if we just simply re-understood or looked back to again non-hegemonic sources of knowledge, and instead we would understand history and evolution so differently. That wasn't one of the books that I was going to suggest, but it is obviously, I think, worth reading, and it is certainly fuel for imagination in terms of kind of how things actually, are not as fixed, right? This idea of the state system is not as fixed. This idea of capitalism as normal, as something that is inevitable and always going to be there, is also not fixed, right? So I think that book brilliantly troubles some of that. But alongside with Milli's kind of pointing to Alexis Pauline Gumbs, I read everything that Adrienne Marie Brown writes, and I find that her words are kind of a source of both nourishment and inspiration and hope and grounding in my own thinking. And so, I mean, for those who haven't read her work, Adrienne Marie Brown writes pleasure activism. She writes immersion strategy. She writes a new book called Holding Change. There's much more. There's a podcast. There's so many things that she does.
Her Octavia Butler podcast is fantastic.
Her Octavia Butler, her absolutely
Fantastic.
Fables and there's just so much there that she does. I think that's really generative. And I was gonna kind of cheat by saying all of her books, but also highlight Maggie Nelson's latest book of criticism on freedom, which is also another. I also read everything Maggie Nelson writes and find it to be challenging and provocative and brilliant. And I think the thing that I took away from On Freedom which is really a meditation on what that means and how that word, I actually driving yesterday, you see signs on the side of the road that say freedom. and it's like, well, is it freedom in terms of anti-oppression and the emancipation of all people from systems of harm? Or is it freedom in terms of the kind of the Trumpian, faux American liberty around what that actually means? And Maggie Nelson's book really brings it home to this idea of praxis, right? This idea of the practice of freedom is the morning after, and the morning after that. It is, as she puts it, if we're lucky, what takes up most of our waking lives, right? That it's an unending praxis of building more free worlds in our relationships, in our bodies, in our communities. And so I think it's something that's really grounded me lately. And then I'll just end by saying a book that I know a lot of people have read, and I am overjoyed when I hear conversations about this book in groups that I wouldn't expect to be talking about this book, but is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and really everything Robin Kimmerer has written, including her brilliant book on moss. But for me, this book is just such a necessary read right now when we're trying to navigate that tension between what we know from science and especially in our world, from the academy, right? Versus what we know from being humans in the world with hearts and bodies, and this that tension between different sources of knowledge is just so brilliantly kind of illustrated and articulated in her work. And I learn so much when I read anything she's written, in part because I wasn't trained in any way, kind of as an ecologist or really with an attention to the environment. And yet, as I think both of Milli and my work has evolved, it's really grown in its attention to, to thinking about what does permaculture teach us about how to think about transformation of the society, right? It's something that was marginal to my education, but is actually central to my understanding of politics now. What do we learn about ecosystems thinking and holistic kind of systems thinking in terms of thinking about social transformation and women's empowerment, right? And so the more that I read books in that field, I think the more that I find myself really excited about some of the connections between the lived environment and the social world. And I know that I have a lot more to learn. And so that's also why I love her books.
Well, thanks for that. And everything that we mentioned, as always, I'll include them in the description. And I think this is a fantastic note to end this conversation. And really, I want to thank you both for your time.
Thank you so much, Joey. It was such an honor to talk with you, and such a
pleasure,
a joy to kind of have these conversations in our various different time zones and locations around the world. So thank you so much.
Defy These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.